They thought he was just another corporate yes-man. Wrestling fans around the world had watched Triple H transform from rebellious D-Generation X-leader into what appeared to be a suit-wearing WWE executive more concerned with stock prices than performer safety. But what happened in his private office last night after reviewing classified footage of Bronson Reed and Bron Breakker's systematic torture campaign against Roman Reigns wasn't just another corporate damage control meeting, it was the explosive moment when Paul Levesque remembered who he used to be before WWE's corporate machine tried to turn him into another compliant executive, and his reaction to discovering the full scope of their crimes will make you realize that some people can only be pushed so far before they snap and unleash the kind of old-school justice that reminds everyone why you never cross someone who built their reputation on refusing to back down from any fight. The meeting that changed everything happened at exactly 2:17 a.m. in Triple H's executive office, where he had been reviewing security footage, medical reports, and classified intelligence documents that revealed the systematic nature of Reed and Breakker's campaign against Roman Reigns over the past weeks leading up to Clash in Paris. Hunter hadn't slept in 3 days, a corporate insider later revealed with obvious concern about his psychological state. He'd been obsessively reviewing every piece of evidence, every moment of systematic torture, every instance where Reed and Breakker had crossed lines that should never be crossed in professional wrestling. But what Triple H discovered in those classified documents wasn't just evidence of wrestling rivalry gone too far, it was documentation of systematic torture, psychological warfare, and deliberate attempts to cause permanent injury that had been authorized and funded by forces within WWE's own corporate structure. The footage showed things that were never supposed to be recorded, another source revealed with horror at what had been documented. Backstage assaults, systematic poisoning attempts, psychological torture sessions designed to break Roman's spirit before his match in Paris, all of it captured by security cameras and compiled into evidence files. The systematic documentation of torture operations revealed corporate conspiracy that went far beyond normal wrestling storylines into criminal enterprise designed to eliminate Roman through comprehensive physical and psychological destruction. Reed and Breakker weren't just attacking Roman randomly, the source continued with growing recognition of the systematic nature. They had detailed schedules, specific torture protocols, even medical supervision to ensure their systematic abuse would cause maximum damage without immediately killing him. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of what Triple H discovered was the corporate authorization and financial support that had enabled Reed and Breakker's systematic torture campaign against one of WWE's biggest stars. Board meeting minutes showed explicit authorization for enhanced physical conditioning of Roman Reigns, an internal document revealed with euphemistic language that barely concealed systematic torture approval. Budget allocations for specialized performer management services that funded everything from psychological warfare to deliberate injury attempts. The corporate funding and authorization of systematic torture revealed WWE's executive structure as more than entertainment company, it was criminal organization that viewed performer elimination through torture as acceptable business strategy when targets threatened institutional control. Triple H realized that his own company had been paying people to systematically torture one of their biggest stars, another insider observed with recognition of the moral implications that were driving his transformation. But sitting in his office, reviewing hour after hour of systematic torture footage while discovering that his own corporate colleagues had authorized and funded these crimes, Triple H underwent a psychological transformation that revealed the Paul Levesque who had once refused to bow down to corporate authority or accept institutional manipulation. Something snapped in Hunter's mind, a witness to his reaction recalled with awe at the dramatic personality shift. He went from corporate executive trying to manage a difficult situation to someone who looked like he was planning to personally eliminate everyone involved in systematic torture operations. The psychological transformation that overtook Triple H as he processed the scope of Reed and Breakker's corporate-sponsored crimes revealed someone whose authentic personality had been suppressed but not eliminated by years of executive responsibility and institutional compliance. Hunter started making phone calls, the source continued with growing excitement at his apparent decision to take action. Not to lawyers or corporate damage control specialists, but to people from his past who understood that some situations require direct action rather than diplomatic solutions. But Triple H's most shocking reaction came when he began systematically destroying the corporate documents that had authorized Reed and Breakker's torture campaign, ensuring that the evidence of executive complicity would never be used to protect the criminals from consequences. He was shredding financial records, deleting computer files, even burning paper documents in his office, another witness revealed with satisfaction at his apparent decision to eliminate corporate protection for torture operations. Everything that might be used to claim that Reed and Breakker were following corporate orders rather than committing individual crimes. The systematic destruction of corporate evidence revealed Triple H's decision to ensure that Reed and Breakker would face personal consequences for their torture campaign without being able to hide behind institutional authorization or executive approval. Hunter was eliminating every piece of evidence that might protect them from criminal prosecution. The source continued with recognition of the strategic implications, ensuring that their systematic torture would be treated as individual criminal activity rather than corporate policy. But perhaps the most dramatic aspect of Triple H's transformation was his systematic renunciation of his executive position and corporate responsibilities, choosing personal justice over institutional loyalty when forced to choose between protecting performers or protecting the company. Hunter submitted his resignation, an HR source revealed with shock at the sudden decision. Not just from creative responsibilities, but from all corporate positions, all executive roles, all institutional authority that might prevent him from taking direct action against systematic torture operations. The complete abandonment of corporate authority revealed Triple H's decision that some situations transcended professional considerations and required personal intervention when institutional systems had failed to protect performers from systematic abuse. He turned in his corporate keycards, cancelled his executive privileges, even liquidated his WWE stock holdings. The source continued with recognition of the comprehensive nature of his break from institutional loyalty. But Triple H's most chilling statement came when he addressed the security cameras in his office, knowing that his message would be transmitted to everyone involved in Reed and Breakker's systematic torture campaign. Bronson Reed, Bron Breakker, Triple H's voice carried through the corporate surveillance system with authority that transcended executive power and entered the realm of personal threat. You made a mistake when you thought corporate authorization would protect you from consequences for systematic torture. The direct challenge to corporate-sponsored torture operations revealed Triple H's transformation from institutional manager to personal enforcer who would ensure that systematic abuse faced immediate and overwhelming retaliation. I am no longer Triple H, WWE executive, his voice continued with certainty that made everyone understand the permanent nature of his transformation. I am Paul Levesque, and I'm coming for everyone who participated in systematic torture operations against performers who were supposed to be under my protection. But perhaps the most significant aspect of Triple H's reaction was his systematic exposure of the corporate executives who had authorized and funded Reed and Breakker's torture campaign, ensuring that their crimes would not be limited to individual accountability. Nick Khan personally signed the authorization documents. Triple H announced through corporate surveillance systems that would transmit his revelations throughout WWE's executive structure. Stephanie McMahon approved the budget allocations. Board members voted to fund systematic torture operations against their own contracted performers. The systematic exposure of corporate complicity in torture operations ensured that Reed and Breakker's individual crimes would be understood as part of comprehensive institutional conspiracy rather than isolated criminal activity. Every executive who voted for Roman's systematic torture, Triple H continued his exposure of corporate conspiracy. Every board member who allocated funds for performer abuse, every corporate officer who authorized psychological warfare, all of you are now targets for the same kind of justice that Reed and Breakker are about to experience. But Triple H's most powerful moment came when he directly addressed Roman Reigns through the surveillance system, apologizing for his failure to protect WWE's biggest star from systematic corporate torture while promising that comprehensive justice would be delivered to everyone involved. Roman, Triple H's voice carried genuine emotion as he acknowledged his institutional failure. I failed you as an executive, I failed you as a leader, and I failed you as someone who was supposed to ensure that WWE remained a place where performers could work without being systematically tortured by their own colleagues. The personal apology revealed Triple H's understanding that his corporate role had made him complicit in systematic torture through his failure to prevent or stop operations that should never have been authorized. But Paul Levesque has never failed anyone who needed protection. He continued with transformation back to his authentic identity. And everyone who participated in your systematic torture is about to learn why corporate authorization means nothing when you cross lines that should never be crossed. But perhaps the most immediate consequence of Triple H's transformation was his systematic recruitment of wrestlers and industry personnel who shared his outrage about systematic torture operations and were willing to support direct action against corporate-sponsored abuse. Hunter started making recruitment calls, a locker room source revealed with growing excitement about the resistance being organized. Reaching out to performers who had been victimized by corporate abuse, industry veterans who remembered when wrestling protected its own, anyone with the courage to stand up against systematic torture. The systematic organization of resistance against corporate torture operations revealed Triple H's understanding that individual action wouldn't be sufficient to eliminate institutional programs designed to abuse performers for business purposes. Mick Foley, Steve Austin, The Rock, he was calling everyone who had ever stood up to corporate authority. The source continued with recognition of the legendary names being recruited for systematic justice operations. But Triple H's most strategic decision was his systematic exposure of corporate torture programs to federal authorities, ensuring that Reed and Breakker's crimes would face legal consequences that transcended wrestling industry internal politics. Hunter provided classified documents to FBI investigators. A law enforcement source confirmed with satisfaction that justice would be served through official channels. Evidence of systematic torture, corporate conspiracy, and deliberate performer abuse that could result in federal charges and criminal prosecution. The involvement of federal law enforcement ensured that corporate torture operations would face consequences that executive authority or institutional protection couldn't prevent or minimize. RICO charges, conspiracy to commit assault, systematic abuse of employees, the evidence Hunter provided could destroy WWE's entire corporate structure. The source continued with recognition of the legal implications. But standing in his empty office, having abandoned corporate authority to pursue personal justice, Triple H delivered his most powerful statement about performer protection and the responsibility of wrestling leadership to ensure safety rather than enable systematic abuse. Wrestling is supposed to be about competition, entertainment, and athletic achievement. Triple H's voice carried the authority of someone who had built legendary career on authentic performance rather than corporate manipulation. When it becomes about systematic torture and performer elimination, it stops being wrestling and becomes something evil that must be eliminated. The moral framework that Triple H established for judging corporate torture operations provided clear distinction between acceptable wrestling competition and criminal abuse that transcended all professional and legal boundaries. Reed and Breakker forgot that wrestling has always been protected by people who refuse to accept systematic abuse as normal business practice. He continued with recognition of the industry's historical resistance to institutional corruption. But perhaps the most significant outcome of Triple H's transformation was the immediate impact it had on WWE's corporate structure, which realized that their systematic torture operations had created enemies within their own executive leadership who possessed both the knowledge and determination to eliminate institutional abuse programs. Board members started requesting emergency security, a corporate source revealed with obvious fear about the consequences of their torture authorization. Understanding that their systematic abuse of performers had created resistance from people who knew all their secrets and possessed the resources to eliminate corporate protection, the corporate fear that Triple H's transformation generated provided hope that institutional torture programs might be eliminated through internal resistance rather than requiring external intervention or legal action. Every executive who had authorized performer abuse suddenly understood that their corporate authority wouldn't protect them from people who valued performer safety over institutional loyalty. The source continued with satisfaction at the power shift. But perhaps the most personally satisfying aspect of Triple H's reaction was his systematic planning for the elimination of Reed and Breakker's ability to ever again participate in torture operations against any performer in any wrestling company. Hunter was planning something comprehensive, a final insider revealed with anticipation. Not just punishment for their past crimes, but permanent elimination of their capability to threaten any performer ever again, regardless of corporate backing or institutional authorization. The comprehensive nature of Triple H's plan justice promised to protect not just Roman Reigns but all wrestling performers from future systematic torture operations by eliminating the individual operators and corporate systems that enabled such abuse. Reed and Breakker are about to learn what happens when you systematically torture performers under the protection of someone who remembers that wrestling leadership means protecting people, not enabling their abuse. The source concluded with certainty about the justice that was approaching. The wrestling world was struggling to process Triple H's shocking transformation from corporate executive to personal enforcer of performer protection, and his systematic reaction to discovering Reed and Breakker's corporate-sponsored torture campaign against Roman Reigns. But most importantly, Triple H had proven that some people cannot be permanently corrupted by corporate authority, that authentic leadership values will eventually overcome institutional compliance when forced to choose between protecting performers or protecting corporate interests. They tried to turn Hunter into another corporate suit, one final observer noted with admiration for his transformation, but they forgot that Paul Levesque built his career on refusing to bow down to authority figures who tried to control him through institutional power. The shocking reaction that changed everything had restored hope that wrestling leadership could choose performer protection over corporate compliance, that authentic values could overcome institutional corruption, and that systematic torture operations would face elimination by people who remembered that wrestling was supposed to protect its own rather than enable their systematic abuse. Triple H's transformation from corporate executive to performer protector represented more than individual awakening. It was proof that authentic leadership principles could survive corporate conditioning and emerge stronger when confronted with systematic evil that demanded immediate and overwhelming response.